Thank you very much for the introduction. And actually, we were going to introduce ourselves, but you've already done it for us. So I guess really what I'd like... Well, actually, we've been gassing a lot before this even started, and we have so many stories. We thought, let's just have a conversation, because we had so many stories to share. And I guess where really the link starts for me is that I had been invited to perform at the Windmill Theatre to commemorate 40 years since the last burlesque show there in 1964. So I went back in 2004. And I'd say that the decor was pretty much Joan Collins does 30s. Very camp, very glitter, slightly trashy, but fabulously trashy. And when I was...
Story of my life.
And when I was actually in the dressing rooms, all the dressing rooms, I mean, it was like being in a bunker. It was, yeah, absolutely airless and sort of, you know, all the dressing rooms were named after cities that had been bombed in the war. I think I was in Leeds or Glasgow. And
no change there then.
Yes. And I'm sort of surrounded by stripper shoes because, of course, it's being used for more pole dancing and lap dancing. But I always wondered, you know, what it was really like to be there during the 50s. And I feel so honoured to be talking to you because you can tell me and everyone what it was really like.
Where to start? How long have you all got? There's no brownie points for guessing which era I come from. Immodesty, obviously, is the younger version. Yes. I had the privilege, really. At the time, I didn't realise it was a privilege, but I actually worked at the Windmill Theatre for 3 years during the mid-1950s. It was still had a kind of glorious glamour about it. It hadn't quite gone into recession then at all. And to become a windmill girl in those days was considered reasonably unusual because we were considered a bit naughty and a bit risque for our time. Which I think by today's standards, as you say, oh, you see more on the beach at Saint-Tropez than you used to see at the windmill. That's not exactly true. There was... It's all right, my husband's sitting over there, he doesn't know. There was a legislation that was brought out way, way back when Vivian Van Dam took over the theatre with Mrs. Henderson. I don't know if any of you saw the film. It was very, very good, the film, followed it very closely. It was a little bit titillated, but it followed it fairly closely. The legislation was that we could be nude on stage, but we couldn't move. Not an iota if we didn't have any clothes on. So if we showed a titty, we couldn't move. But the funnier part was that if we did show all that we had to show it completely hairless. The day we were born, completely. Apart from our hair on our head. We were allowed that, that was okay. Which led to quite a strange kind of camaraderie amongst the girls, sharing razor blades and such.
And I find this really interesting because some people get really shocked that I'll go down to a Merkin sometimes. And I think, hey, you know what? These girls, they would actually go naked. And so there's often this sort of, I like to call it a friendly disagreement with modern performers, where some of them will say, "Oh, you know, it was just mildly risque," and then others will say, "Well, no, they really did strip down."
Absolutely. Well, actually, the actual pure nude posing was on a high plinth, about 4 foot high, about 4 inches square, and Charlie was in charge of the stepladder, and he used to take the stepladder and you. To your plinth, and you went up the stepladder, you stood on the plinth, you gave him your dressing gown and nobody else, you took your pose, and you had to stand for 5 or 6 minutes. The curtain opened and you gazed into the distance, looking very glamorous, thinking about what you were going to have for supper that night.
But what I find really funny is that now I've done this on stage before where I've gone for my big reveal and the bras come off and the band is right behind me and they get the full view first. But Jean, now...
Oh, that knocked your eye out.
You were saying to me earlier that actually you had to have the stage crew would leave the stage.
That was an interesting point. Strangely enough, because we were completely denuded of personal foliage, I want to put a better word on it, Mr. Van Dam was very proper. In fact, the whole theatre was run on a very much, almost like a girls' college, really. It was really very, very strict. During the fan dances, which again, you had nothing but a hat and a pair of shoes and two huge fans that went from under your chin to your toes. They weighed a ton. You had to jam your little finger in, and they had steel struts. Now, that's no mean task. Imagine two of these monsters, and they were huge, and you had to dance gracefully with them. And they were terribly heavy.
Yeah, when they say light as a feather, they're not.
Absolutely. And you because you had nothing on, the ruling in the theatre was during the fan dance, every stagehand, apart from the old stage manager who'd been there since Methuselah, who'd been there forever, all the stage crew had to leave the stage. And they used to go out through the stage door and have a cigarette and stand around until the fan dance was finished. That's the kind of modesty, if you forgive the pun, that was around it at the same time. We were considered quite sort of modest in our behaviour.
I'm really interested in how other people saw you, how other people in the audience saw you. There was once a legend who I spoke to, Tura Satana, who said, you know, we used to be ladies on stage, and if you behaved like a lady, the men would be more chivalrous. They behave more like a gentleman. But
I've been around too long.
How did the audience behave with you?
Well, strangely enough, I was there for 3 years, and it is absolute truth, so help me, I did not meet one member of the gentleman audience. When I say gentleman audience, the first 2 rows were all with the lads, the gentlemen with their own Macs. By the way, if anyone was a naughty boy and misbehaved himself, we reported it to the stage manager, and he was politely escorted out. It was that proper. I never once met anybody from the audience, but sometimes when you came in the theatre quite early at 11 in the morning, ready to prepare for, because we did 6 shows a day, you know, 6 shows a day. There was 2 companies, A and B. Both 2 companies, there was 40 girls in each company, plus about 6 or 8 men dancers and a couple of singers. And the guest acts were separate to the review. That is like your Bruce Forsyths and Harry Secombes and people like that. They used to come as a guest act for 6 weeks because the show changed every 6 weeks. And it was an old-fashioned review, nothing more. The only thing different was saucy costumes, sequins placed in the right place, very high-cut leotards, you know, the leotard, very high-cut. We used to wear little transparently net gauze G-strings on very thin elastic up the nether regions. And this was unheard of in those days. It were considered very, very, very risque that you had a very high cut and a very low cut. But the show was very unsexy, if you know what I mean. It really was. Like
well, to you it was unsexy, but I think to the audience they probably thought something different.
First 2 rows used to enjoy themselves, yeah.
People will often ask me, they'll be surprised if they ask me, you know, who comes to see my shows? And I'll say, you know what, about 60% of my audience is actually women. And people are often surprised by that, but I think the women love the artistry, they love the glamour. And really it's a kind of erotic titillation that is accessible for everyone. But Jean, you had women in the audience too.
Oh yes, as I said, the first 2 rows exclusively the regular gentlemen. Beyond that was a normal West End theatre audience, strangely enough. It was mixed. We'd get sort of fan mail from ordinary people that came and enjoyed the show, the same as any theatre would get that kind of contact. But we were such a unit, doing 6 shows a day, alternate days, A and B company. One day you went into the theatre at 11, you did your 6 shows and came out at 11 in the evening. And as Modesty said, our dressing rooms left a bit to be desired. They were 2 layers below, no windows, nothing at all. So you went into the gloom and you came out in the gloom at 11 o'clock at night. You didn't know what the weather was like. And we were a complete sealed unit because the theatre itself in those days all belonged to Vivian van Dam. He actually owned the whole building. And I think it was left to him by Mrs. Henderson, who had previously owned it in the 30s. It was actually bequeathed to him in a will. And down, you had 2 layers of dressing rooms underground, stage almost at street level, stairs, stone stairs going up the back, and then you went through the various stratas, some more dressing rooms. Above that was wardrobe, above that was millinery, or wardrobe and millinery, above that was the where you went to get your wages, admin thing. On top of that was a huge dressing room, rehearsal space with dressing room space, huge rehearsal, big mirrors, bars on the mirrors, just like you would think it would be. It was traditional. And then above that, would you believe, was showers and a huge canteen. And there's nothing more incongruous than seeing Windmill chorus girls clattering up the stairs in their tap shoes and their dressing gown and ordering a chip sandwich and eating it and looking at Mr. Harry Secombe or Bruce Forsyth and just chatting about the weather. It was quite surreal, really, I think you could say.
Well, now, Brucey actually started his career at the Windmill, didn't he?
He did, indeed. And, during my time, actually.
Yeah. And so he was basically developing a comedy act, but as a performer, as a dance performer, first and foremost, and then the comedy came after that. Is that right?
Yes, he was a dancer, what we call a male dancer at the Windmill. Actually, there was a mixture of a little bit of fraternising going on, and actually there's quite a lot of marriages, and there's been an awful lot of children. And now there's an awful lot of grandchildren. We do have a reunion every year, and every year, unfortunately, we're one less. But nevertheless, the ones that turn up, we still say we're still standing. But it is, we talk about grandchildren now, which is quite fun, and great-grandchildren too, some of us. And yes, the boy dancers, there was a smattering of chaps that batted for the other side, which, fair enough, we were all girls together. But there were straight dancers, and quite a lot of us married. In fact, my first husband was a dancer, Alan Wren, at the Windmill, and we were married for about 18 years and produced 2 children. He was a terrific tap dancer. We used to do numbers together in the show. So it was almost run like a little village, a town in itself, because you went in, you stayed all day, you took your lunch and supper breaks in the canteen, your costumes were there. If a hook and eye or sequin fell off, you went to wardrobe, you went and got your wages. You didn't need to sort of go anywhere else. It was completely compact, and you all became like I know it sounds a cliche, but it was very family-like. You were very protective of everybody. If anybody was sort of slandered or treated badly, everybody jumped to defence very quickly.
And I think that follows through the same today, really.
I was going to say, how do you find all this chat about the Windmill? How does it apply today, Modesty? What are your venues like that you work in?
Well, I think really, this is my 15th year. My goodness, 15 years, and from the genre going from really wilderness years through to being as popular as it is today. And when I say popular, we haven't reached the kind of popularity to have dedicated theatres like the Windmill, and many of them, because I don't think we have the level of interest in live entertainment like we had for burlesque before, which is a shame. But, so we've got quite a bit of ground to cover, but going from kind of ground zero that we had in the late 90s, when I started in clubs and I'd be performing in clubs that, my feet would stick to the floor like Raymond Review Bar and JoJo's, and, the changing room would be the coat check. And, to being able to actually, I developed my shows in the music halls like Hoxton and Wilton's Music Hall, because I wanted to make it a theatrical production. I didn't want it to be a club act. I wanted it to have production values. And, you know, did the first ever burlesque West End show, and it threw open a lot of stage space for people to be able to follow once I'd opened that door. So my venues now really have been historic theatres around the world, places like Royal Opera House or Sydney State Theatre. But also intimate venues like the Windmill as well, but places where we can have an actual production. Because really, I mean, I'd like to ask, for me, the burlesque is, it's the funny men, it's the beautiful women, it's the escapism, it's the being able to escape into another world. But it has to be the titillation. Of course it is. That's the burlesque. Yeah. But what is it for you? What's burlesque for you when you were working in the Windmill?
Well, again, don't forget, burlesque was not known in Britain. I mean, we didn't have burlesque here. Absolutely.
It went by another name.
We were kind of London's version of the Folie Bergère, really. More or less similar to that. Again, you say the beauty, the camaraderie, the femininity. I don't know about you, but I never felt a victim, ever. Do you feel a victim?
Oh, God, no.
No, absolutely. I mean, women's lib and what have you. Yes, all right, it has its place. I mean, I'm a tartar to live with. Ask poor old Brian. You know. But... I never felt that I was being exploited, or I chose to stand on that plinth, and I quite enjoyed it because I was who I was, and it didn't bother me. I felt a sort of, almost a kind of pride in it. I don't know why.
And I think that's a pretty amazing place to be able to finish up our 15 minutes and say, what an amazing woman, and what can I say but, wow, once a showgirl, always a showgirl, and you still have the star quality. And I would...
I was going to say...
I would like to be able to get up here and just strike a pose with Jean and say, showgirl sisters, because some things never change. We might be 40 or 50 years apart.
Yeah.
But we're still the same breed.
It's still basically the same.
So we'll strike a pose.